The sound came like a blade tearing through silk, a sharp, piercing cry that jolted the calm morning silence of the airport terminal. It was not the kind of cry people easily ignored. It was raw, urgent, and filled with the panic of something, too small and too helpless to explain itself. Tunde Okafor felt his stomach tighten the moment he heard it. His steps faltered, and the steady rhythm of his polished leather shoes on the tile floor stuttered, unsure. Ahead of him, the boarding gate to Flight 73 to Abuja stood open, but closing fast. The last few passengers had already disappeared into the tunnel, and the airport staff were gathering up their things, clearly preparing to shut the gate. Tunde's mind screamed at him to keep walking. He was less than 30 seconds away from boarding. Everything was timed perfectly. His arrival, the early morning slot, his connecting driver in Abuja, and the most important investor pitch of his career. Months of sleepless nights, negotiations, and carefully crafted financial projections all led to this moment. His business, a solar energy startup targeting low-income rural zones, had finally caught the interest of real, international backers. Missing this flight could cost him everything. But still, he turned. Something in that cry had hooked deep into his chest. He scanned the terminal and spotted a figure in the far corner, a woman crouched on the ground, surrounded by 2 pieces of torn luggage and a small crumpled wrapper. Her arms were tightly wrapped around something small. A baby. The infant's face was scrunched in agony, its tiny fists flailing against the air as if trying to fight whatever was wrong from the inside out. The mother's head was bowed, her shoulders shaking. She rocked the baby in desperation, murmuring something too soft to hear. Tunde stood still, watching for a moment. Passengers passed behind him in a slow, sleepy flow, dragging hand luggage and nodding at their phones. No one else seemed to notice her. She looked almost invisible, a shadow caught in a place where people only looked forward. He glanced back at the gate again. The boarding sign had disappeared. The staff had turned away. If he moved now, if he sprinted and begged, he might still make it. But he didn't. Instead, he walked toward her, slowly, like someone drawn by something not fully understood. As he approached, he could see the panic on her face more clearly. Her eyes were wide, with fear, rimmed red from lack of sleep or too much crying, maybe both. Her lips trembled as she clutched the baby tighter. The child was making a wheezing sound now, sharp and ragged, like a rusted hinge opening and closing. She didn't look up when Tunde knelt beside her. Her whole world was wrapped in that tiny chest rising and falling too quickly. The woman's wrapper was soaked in sweat and milk, and her arms were trembling from exhaustion. She rocked harder, whispering words that trembled and collapsed before they reached her lips. Tunde didn't speak. He didn't know what to say. He wasn't a doctor, not even close. But he remembered once, long ago, when his younger brother choked on boiled yam, and their mother had done something with water and back pats that had made the boy cough and spit and finally breathe again. That memory came like lightning. He opened his bag and pulled out a small bottle of water, unscrewing the cap with shaky fingers. He motioned gently for her to lift the baby upright. She did, eyes full of uncertainty, but no protest. Tunde dipped his fingers into the water and moistened the baby's lips. Then he carefully rubbed along the gums, trying to ease whatever blockage might be there. The baby jolted, coughed, once then again, and then let out a softer, more exhausted cry. The wheezing slowed. The breaths came longer, fuller, though still weak. The mother gasped, as though she'd forgotten to breathe herself until now. She cradled the child and began whispering new words, ones made of thanks and faith and disbelief. Tunde sat back on his heels, finally aware of how loudly his heart had been pounding. The polished floor felt cold against his knees. Around them, the airport continued to hum softly, the distant announcement of another flight, the low whir of cleaning machines, the shuffling of slippers against tile. But for a brief moment, Everything else disappeared. He looked up at the gate. The sign above it was blank now. The door was closed. The jet bridge had already retracted. He was officially too late. He stood slowly and picked up his briefcase. His throat felt dry. There was a numbness spreading through his limbs, not from regret, but from the unexpected weight of the moment. The crying had stopped entirely now. The mother was humming, a soft, broken tune that reminded him of a lullaby he hadn't heard in decades. The baby, exhausted, was asleep against her chest. Tunde turned toward the empty waiting area and walked back without urgency. There was no need to rush anymore. He sat down on a nearby bench, dropped his bag beside him, and closed his eyes for a second. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a message from his assistant checking if he had boarded. He didn't answer. The windows beside him stretched high, allowing the soft light of dawn to flood in. Outside, Flight 73 was slowly taxiing toward the runway, its lights blinking like the last signals of something already too far away. Tunde watched it move, slowly at first, then with greater speed as it lined up and finally roared forward, lifting into the orange sky. It rose cleanly and curved into the clouds, leaving a faint white trail behind. For a long moment, he just watched the sky. The clouds were thin and low, the kind that made the sun look like it was shining through gauze. He didn't know why he felt what he felt. He had missed the most important flight of his life. But somehow he didn't feel angry or regretful. He just felt still. Tunde exhaled and leaned back, not knowing that in exactly 12 minutes, every television in the terminal would flash red with breaking news, and everything he thought he had lost would take on an entirely different meaning. It began with silence, a kind of unnatural stillness that settled over the airport like a shroud. Tunde noticed it before he understood it. The low hum of conversation, the casual scraping of luggage wheels, the distant rustling of newspapers, all of it dulled, like someone had taken the sound and pressed it deep into cotton. Even the televisions mounted high on the walls above, the gates seemed quieter than before, as if they were holding their breath. He blinked, sat up straighter. Something had shifted. Across the waiting area, a man in a security uniform stood frozen, eyes locked on the nearest TV screen. Beside him, a woman with a headscarf clutched her chest. She wasn't speaking, but her lips were moving fast. Praying. 2 children had stopped running around the chairs. One of them pointed up. Tunde turned to look. The news anchor's voice came low and steady, but behind her composure was a tremor that gave everything away. The red banner across the screen read, "Breaking Nigerian domestic plane crash. Flight 73. Feared down after takeoff. At first, he didn't move. His brain pushed back, refusing the words. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be real. Flight 73 had just taken off. He had watched it lift clean into the sky, slicing the horizon like a needle through silk. There had been no explosion, no fire, no drama, just quiet, graceful. And now, this? He stood slowly, as if rising too fast would break something fragile inside him. The volume on the television rose. More people were gathering now, drawn by the gravity of disaster. The footage had cut to a shaky video taken by a bystander. Smoke, thick, dark, and heavy, poured from a tree line somewhere beyond the outskirts of the city. Pieces of silver metal lay scattered across the brush like fallen birds. Emergency sirens screamed faintly in the background. The wreckage didn't look like a plane. It looked like sorrow made solid. Tunde couldn't feel his hands. The announcer's voice continued, words heavy with confirmation. Eyewitnesses report that Flight 73 experienced engine failure shortly after takeoff. Authorities are still confirming the total number of casualties, but early reports suggest... She paused. Her voice broke. Then she whispered it, like it was a secret she wished she didn't have to share. No survivors have been found. He sat down again, not because he wanted to, but because his body seemed to forget how to stay upright. A sound came from his throat, not quite a cry, not quite a gasp. Somewhere between disbelief and the beginning of something deeper, something that might become grief if given the chance. His phone buzzed again. He didn't need to look to know what it was. Messages would be flooding in, people asking if he was on that flight, if he was okay, if it was true. His assistant, his brother in Lagos, his business partner. He didn't respond. Instead, he looked at his hands. A few minutes ago, they had been trying to help a choking child, a baby whose face had gone red from struggling to breathe, a baby he had never met, who had no idea what a flight or an investor meeting was, whose entire world had been a breath that almost didn't come. And now here he sat, alive, while an entire plane full of people, mothers, children, professionals, dreamers, were gone. Gone. The truth arrived like a quiet tap on the shoulder. He had been meant to be on that plane. He had missed it by 5 minutes. Not even 5, 4 and some seconds. And the only reason he had missed it, the only reason he had turned around, was because of that baby's scream. That single, inconvenient, agonizing scream. That scream had saved his life. He looked, up slowly, scanning the terminal for the woman. She was still seated on the floor, now supported by another traveler, sipping slowly from a juice bottle. The baby was sleeping again. Peaceful, as if nothing had happened. He wanted to stand, to walk over to her, to say something, anything. But nothing came. What could he say? That the life she had been trying to save had accidentally saved. His? That her child had somehow, unknowingly, held back a man from stepping into death. The weight of it all pressed down on him like a wet blanket. The survivors always carried something extra, not just gratitude, but guilt. The haunting question of why me? The unfairness of the numbers. The randomness of who gets to live because of a missed alarm or a crying baby. Tunde wasn't a man easily shaken. Years in business had taught him to stay composed, to always be calculating, composed, alert. But now, sitting on that cold bench with news anchors whispering tragedy into the stale airport air, he felt like a child again, small, shaken, and completely undone. The boarding gate for Flight 73 was still lit, up, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Behind him, someone began to cry, soft at first, then louder. A woman near the snack counter collapsed into the arms of a stranger. A man punched the wall and didn't stop. People were checking their phones, searching passenger lists, replaying the videos, each of them hoping not to see a familiar name, a familiar face. Tunde did not check. He didn't want to. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, head in hands, and for the first time in years, he whispered a prayer, not for himself, but for those who didn't turn around, who didn't pause, who never heard the scream that would have saved them. 2 days passed, but time had lost its shape. It no longer moved in hours or minutes, only in blinks. One moment Tunde was staring at his untouched bowl of ogi on the kitchen table, and in the next, he'd be standing in the hallway, unsure of how he got there. His apartment in Lagos felt too quiet, too still. The walls seemed to hum with the voices of people he never got to meet, voices that belonged to Flight 73. Since returning home, he had barely left the couch. His phone vibrated constantly. Reporters, friends, colleagues, even distant cousins he hadn't heard from in years. Some were crying, others screaming with relief that he was alive. A few didn't know what to say at all. His assistant, Chica, sent an endless stream of apologies and condolences. The investors had postponed the meeting indefinitely. One of them had lost his own niece on the flight. The pitch would have to wait. But Tunde couldn't think about business, couldn't think about profits, shares, expansion. All he could think about was the cry. That one sound in the terminal that had split his life into two timelines, one where he boarded the plane and became a name scrolled across the bottom of news screens, and the other, this one, where he now sat staring at his palms like they were stained. Sleep came in short bursts if it came at all. When it did, the dreams were thick and full of fire. He would see smoke filling the cabin, people screaming, babies crying, always crying, until everything exploded into silence. Then he'd wake up sweating, mouth dry, staring at the ceiling, like it could offer some explanation. But it never did. On the third morning, something small pulled him out of the fog, a knock on the door. Light, hesitant. He opened it to find a young man in a delivery vest holding a small brown envelope. "For Mr. Tunde Okafor," the boy said, head slightly bowed. Tunde nodded, took the envelope, and thanked him without much voice. Inside was a note, handwritten in slightly uneven script. "Sir, this is from the woman you helped at the airport. She asked me to deliver it on her behalf. Her name is Sade. The baby's name is Adaze. She said she never got to thank you properly." Underneath the note was a small photo, a snapshot printed from a cheap phone camera. In it, Sade stood beside a market stall, holding the baby in her arms. Adaze was awake this time, eyes wide and curious, mouth open in mid-laugh. She looked alive in the purest sense, the kind of alive that reminded Tunde just how close she'd come to not being. He sat down slowly, holding the photo in both hands. Something in his chest loosened, something tight, like a knot of wire. The baby's face was a reminder that life went on, that something good had happened too, that all the loss hadn't erased the small, fragile gift of survival. Later that day, he found himself back at the airport, not to travel, he had no destination, but because he needed to return to the place where everything had changed. He needed to see it with different eyes. The terminal was quieter than before. The buzz of daily travel had resumed, but there was a cautious edge to the atmosphere, like everyone was tiptoeing around the memory of what had happened. A small memorial had been set up by Gate 4, the same gate he had stood at days ago. Flowers, photographs, folded notes, even airline tickets scrawled with final messages. Tunde approached slowly, heart heavy. He saw names, faces, children, a couple holding hands in one picture, a pastor from Benin, a nurse returning home. He stood there for a long time, reading each name silently, mouthing quiet prayers for people he never met. Each face was a thread, in the fabric of something bigger, something more delicate than he had ever realized. And then, from behind him, came a voice he remembered. "You came back." He turned. Sade stood there, in a faded blue dress, Adaze wrapped tightly to her back. She looked tired but calm, eyes clearer now, a little less frantic. There was something grounded in the way she stood, like a woman who had passed through fire and was learning how to walk on solid ground again. "I didn't know how to find you," she said softly, "but I prayed you were safe." Tunde swallowed hard. He wanted to say thank you, or maybe I'm sorry, or even just I remember you, but all the words tangled in his throat. So instead, he reached into his bag and handed her the photo she'd sent. "She looks strong," he finally managed. Sade smiled. "She is. You helped her breathe. That was everything." Tunde nodded slowly, eyes still on the child's sleeping face. There was no big revelation in that moment, no loud thunder from the sky. Just a quiet understanding between two people who had shared a moment that changed both their lives. Sade reached out then, hesitant at first, and gently lifted Adaze from her back. She held the child in her arms, then extended her toward Tunde. "Would you like to hold her?" He hesitated, then nodded. The weight of the baby settled into his arms. Light, warm, real. Adizi shifted slightly, a small hand curling against his chest. Her breath came slow and steady, a rhythm that quieted everything else around them. And in that stillness, Tunde found something he didn't realize he'd been searching for. Peace. Not the kind that forgets or erases the pain, but the kind that makes room for both sorrow and grace, for endings and beginnings, for death and for breath. As Tunde cradled the child in his arms, he felt the strange, almost sacred pulse of life within her. Warm, rhythmic, and entirely unaware of the weight she now carried in his eyes. Adezi's breath rose and fell, against his chest, soft and steady like ocean waves at dawn. She was heavier than he expected, not in mass, but in meaning. Every tiny breath she took seemed to echo louder than any boardroom applause, louder than every deal he had ever closed. He didn't speak. Neither did Sade. For several minutes they stood there in silence near the memorial wall as travelers moved around them like a stream splitting around a stone. Some glanced, others paused, sensing something solemn in the air, but most simply walked on, unaware that a moment of quiet redemption was unfolding just steps from their gate. Tunde's fingers, usually quick with a calculator or business pitch, now moved slowly, gently brushing a crease from the baby's blanket. He didn't fully understand what he was feeling, a strange mixture of guilt and grace. He had survived something that should have ended him, and he had done nothing extraordinary to deserve that mercy. No last-minute brilliance, no clever escape. Just a moment of pause, a cry, a choice to turn around. And because he turned, he lived. It was this thought, small but sharp, that stayed with him as he handed Adezi back into her mother's waiting arms. Sade received her with a grace that spoke of ancient strength, the kind of strength found in women who raise children with nothing but prayer and persistence, who stretch a single blessing across an entire month. "You saved her," she said. Again, voice hushed. "And maybe she saved you too." Tunde didn't respond, but the words rooted deep inside him. They walked together for a while, the three of them. Not far, just along the edge of the terminal, past Gate 5, then toward the open glass wall where the morning light fell in golden slices across the chairs. It was the same light that had bathed the runway 2 days earlier when he'd watched Flight 73 rise into the clouds, the same light that now revealed how completely different the world looked. There was something about airports, places of arrival and departure, of hellos and final goodbyes, that made everything feel more fragile, as if time stretched thinner here, more easily broken. Tunde had always moved through them with purpose, eyes on the clock, feet pointed forward, head filled with numbers. But now, for the first time, he slowed. They found an empty bench and sat side by side, the silence still unbroken. Sade shifted. Adiz onto her lap and began humming softly, the same tune he'd heard her sing that first morning. It wasn't quite a lullaby. It was older than that. A tune pulled from the mouth of memory, from the deep well of Yoruba womanhood, something that didn't need words to speak of pain and healing and hope. Tunde listened. He closed his eyes for a moment, and in the dark behind his eyelids, he saw flashes, not of the crash but of what might have been. Himself, seated by the window, glancing once more at his pitch slides. The hum of takeoff, the sudden jolt, screams, fire. A sky turned upside down. He saw it all not because it had happened to him, but because it had almost happened. And somehow, that made it more terrifying. He opened his eyes again. The airport speakers announced a new flight boarding at Gate 3. Life was continuing. People were moving on. But something in him had shifted. "I used to think life was all about momentum," he finally said, not looking at Sade. "Moving forward, growing fast, getting bigger, more deals, more money, more everything." Sade didn't reply, just watched him carefully. "I thought missing that flight would be the worst thing that ever happened to me," he continued. "But now I think it was the best mistake I ever made." Sade nodded slowly, her eyes lowering to her daughter's face. "Not every delay is a curse," she said gently. "Sometimes God stops you so he can spare you." The words hit Tunde with quiet force. They didn't sound religious in the heavy way he often avoided. They sounded human, like truth stripped of decoration. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded sheet, a copy of his presentation, the one he had meant to deliver in Abuja, the same one he had obsessed over for weeks. He looked at it for a long second, then slowly tore it in half, and again, until the pieces were too small to hold shape. He dropped them into a nearby bin and sat back with a breath that felt clearer than the ones before. He had no idea what would come next, whether the investors would reschedule, whether the business would survive the delay, whether anything would return to what it was. But for the first time in years, he wasn't chasing answers. He was simply grateful to be here, to be breathing, to be watching a baby sleep. He turned to Saad. "Do you need anything?" he asked softly. "For her?" She looked surprised at first, then thoughtful. "I need what every mother needs," she said. "A little help, a little peace, a little future." Tunde nodded. He could do that. Later that day, he made 2 calls. The first was to Chika, his assistant. He asked her to help locate a pediatric clinic near Sade's neighborhood and set up regular checkups, on his account. The second call was to a quiet nonprofit he had once donated to without much thought. This time, he asked to meet with their director. His business might still grow, maybe bigger than before, or maybe not. But something else had taken root, a new kind of purpose, one not tied to quarterly projections, but to the quiet miracle of breath, the ones that almost stopped, and the ones that continued because someone had listened. 3 weeks after the crash, Tunde found himself standing in front of a small, half-finished school building at the edge of a village he had never heard of before. The sun hung low behind the trees, casting long shadows over the dusty yard where a few barefoot children kicked a deflated football between them, their laughter rising like smoke into the fading light. He had followed a thread that began in the airport, not out of obligation, but out of a need he couldn't name. It was the same thread that had led him to donate new solar panels to the clinic near Sadie's compound, the same one that now led him here, to this cracked school foundation in Ogun State. It started with a single question that refused to leave his mind. What if the delay wasn't just for me? What if being pulled back from that gate wasn't only about survival, but about redirection? About being turned, gently but firmly, toward something he had been too blind to see? He had built his company to solve problems, yes, energy access, infrastructure, development, but it had always been about scale, about moving fast and wide. Now, for the first time, he began to wonder if the real work was supposed to be slower, closer, more personal, less glamorous, more faithful. Maybe the miracle wasn't in the pitch room, but in a child breathing easier beneath a working fan. Maybe legacy wasn't built in boardrooms, but in small places no one photographed. The man leading him around the schoolyard was thin, soft-spoken, with a slight limp from an old accident. His name was Baba Ade, the village elder and unofficial headmaster of the primary school. He moved slowly, with careful steps and a constant awareness of his surroundings, as if every inch of this land mattered. "They sit on stones now, Baba," Ade explained as they entered one of the unfinished classrooms. "Some bring plastic buckets from home. We make do." The room was little more than 4 walls and a roof. No paint, no windows, no desks, just chalk lines on cement and small scuff marks where tiny feet had shuffled day after day. But something in the space felt alive, the kind of life that can only come from struggle, from daily choosing to continue despite the lack. Tunde walked to the center of the room and stood still. He imagined the children here, Adaisi even, growing up in this kind of place. Learning to read with crumbling books, raising hands that had never touched a computer, never seen their own village from a bird's-eye view. He imagined futures choked before they even had air. He reached into his folder and pulled out a page. Not a business proposal. Just a drawing, rough, hand-sketched, of a solar setup with wiring for lights and a small learning center powered by basic tablets and a router. The kind of plan he used to pitch to corporations, now offered here for free. "We can build this," he said to Baba Ade, holding it out. "I'll fund it myself, quietly, no press." The old man took the page, looked at it, and nodded. No speech. Just gratitude carved deep into the lines of his face. Outside, the children still played, their laughter echoing against the walls. The sound made Tunde's chest ache with something he didn't quite recognize. Not sadness, not joy. Maybe it was the simple weight of presence. The fact that he was here, alive, hearing them, that he hadn't boarded that plane. That someone had screamed, and he had listened. That night, back in his rented flat in Abeokuta, Tunde sat by the window and wrote in his journal. Something he hadn't done in years. The words came slowly, but with unusual clarity. He wrote, not about revenue or expansion, but about breath. About the pause. About the people whose lives intersected with his because he missed a flight. He wrote about Said and Adaiz, and even the janitor who had said, "You chose life." He didn't know the man's name, but he remembered his face, the simplicity of his truth. In the margins of the page, he scribbled a single sentence and circled it twice. Maybe protection doesn't always look like safety. Sometimes it looks like inconvenience. The next morning, he visited a tailor in the village and ordered uniforms for the school children. On his way out, he passed a small kiosk with a radio tuned to a call-in show. The topic was Flight 73. Again. People were still mourning, still questioning. The crash had become more than an event. It was a national wound. A scar that had no single villain, no clear solution. Just pain and loss and endless questions. The caller on the radio spoke with a shaking voice. Her husband had been on the flight. A good man, a good father. She didn't understand why God had taken him, why others were spared. She wasn't angry, only tired. Tunde stood outside the shop listening. His heart heavy. He couldn't offer answers, not to her, not to anyone. But he could offer something else. That evening, he called Chika and told her to cancel all his remaining speaking engagements. No TEDx talks, no press interviews, no investor updates. He didn't want to be anyone's miracle story. He didn't want to be branded as the man who missed the flight. He just wanted to be a man who listened, who gave back. Quietly and slowly, day by day, that's what he did. He still wore his tailored shirts and leather shoes. He still read the Financial Times in the morning. But his hands spent more time in the dirt now, helping lay panels, testing wires, lifting boxes. He made fewer speeches and more silent visits. He paid school fees. He sat on dusty stools and asked, "What do you need?" Without expecting anything in return. People began to call him by a new name in the villages, Baba Ina, the father of light. Not because he brought electricity, but because he showed up where the lights had long gone out. It wasn't the nightmares that haunted Tunde most. It was the quiet. The kind of silence that filled the cracks of his days and settled inside him when the work paused. During the nights when the generator fell still and the hum of the village dropped into hush, he would find himself lying awake, listening not to the world, but to the memories playing softly behind his eyes. In the stillness, the guilt returned, not loud, not accusing, but persistent. The faces of the lost from Flight 73 rose in his mind one by one. A mother pressing a bottle into her child's mouth before takeoff. A man laughing at a text just before boarding. A young girl twirling a boarding pass like a ribbon. People he had never met, but now carried within him as if their names were etched into his ribs. He sometimes wondered if any of them had noticed the delay. If anyone had glanced around and said, "Wasn't there another passenger?" He wondered what seat he had been assigned. If the person who took it, if it had been taken, was seated by the window. If they had looked out just before the fall. These thoughts didn't cripple him, but they never fully left. They lived beside his gratitude, in uncomfortable balance, grief and grace occupying the same space. Survival wasn't clean. It came with questions. One afternoon, while overseeing the final panel installation at the school, one of the children approached him shyly. Her uniform hung off her shoulders, slightly too big, and her sandals had been mended with string. She looked no older than 8. Her name was Uche. "Uncle Tunde," she said softly, clutching a half-filled notebook to her chest. "Why are you helping us? You're not from here." The question came without judgment, just innocence, but it pierced him deeper than most conversations had in weeks. He crouched beside her, took a moment to find words that made sense. "Because someone helped me," he said simply, "and helping you is helping myself." She blinked, not fully understanding, but smiled anyway. Children didn't always need the full explanation. They understood what mattered: presence, kindness, consistency. The fact that someone showed up again and again. After Uchi skipped back to her classmates, Tunde stayed crouched for a while, feeling the weight of that moment. He realized then that there was no balance sheet for healing, no checklist, no milestone to mark when the soul returns fully to itself. Sometimes it just unfolded slowly, one quiet act at a time. His days grew into rhythm. He spent the mornings at the school, afternoons at the clinic, evenings at the community hall where older women taught him how to stretch fish stew with palm oil and prayers. His suitcases remained unopened, tucked under the bed. His laptop gathered dust. He wrote, less about sales forecasts, more about stories. In the margins of his notebooks, he drew solar grids next to children's names. Beside each name, he jotted notes, dreams they had whispered to him when they didn't know he was listening. "I want to be a nurse. I want to fly a plane. I want to have my own shop." Little dreams, but heavy with hope. And somewhere in those quiet days, a change settled into his bones. He no longer flinched when he heard a plane overhead. He no longer looked away when the news mentioned the crash. Instead, he began attending the monthly grief gatherings held for the victims' families. Not as a survivor, but as a listener. He sat in the back, hands folded, heart open. He didn't speak unless asked. And when he didn't speak of missing the flight. He spoke of what came after. Of the small, invisible kindnesses that rose from grief like green shoots from ash. At one gathering, a young widow stood to speak. Her husband had been a schoolteacher on that flight. She held a photo of him, smiling and soft-eyed. She didn't cry. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. He was never afraid of dying, she said. He was afraid of being forgotten. Those words struck deep. That night, Tunde sat on the porch of his flat, barefoot, watching the stars blink overhead. Sky was clear, so wide and open it made him feel both small and infinite. He thought of the teacher, the widow, the lives left hanging in unfinished stories. And he understood something new. The only way to honor the ones who died was to live more completely. Not louder, not richer, just more honestly. With presence, with heart. He picked up his phone and sent a message to Sadi. "Are you free tomorrow? Morning? I'd like to visit again. Just to hold her. If that's okay?" The reply came minutes later. "She remembers you. She reaches for strangers sometimes, thinking they're you." He smiled. The ache in his chest softened. Maybe love wasn't always fireworks and declarations. Maybe sometimes it was a silent reaching, a breath remembered, a life continuing. The next morning, he brought fresh fruit and a small soft blanket stitched with a daisy's name. She was growing fast now, rounder cheeks, stronger grip. Her smile was quick and wild, like sunlight through leaves. When Sade placed her in his arms, she curled against him without hesitation, and for a long while, Tunde simply held her. He didn't check his phone. He didn't think about what had been lost. He just breathed, and a daze breathed with him. On the 1-month anniversary of the crash, a memorial service was held near the edge of the capital, a quiet field set aside by the city council, with temporary tents and rows of folding chairs laid out beneath a pale sky. There was no fanfare, no long speeches, just names printed on cloth banners, flowers brought by strangers, and the silence of people who had run out of ways to mourn. A soft wind passed through the crowd, like a sigh too old to remember its source. Tunde stood at the back, away from the cameras and microphones, hands folded, head slightly bowed. He didn't wear black, as most did. He wore a simple beige tunic and trousers, the same ones he now wore to the school on Fridays. A man beside him was crying quietly, shoulders shaking. A woman gripped a framed photo of her daughter so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. There was no language for this kind of grief, only gestures, breathing, waiting. The organizers lit 73 candles, one for each life lost. The flames danced uncertainly in the wind, like they too knew the weight of being left behind. One by one, people were invited to step forward and light candles for their loved ones. And one by one they did, holding back tears, whispering names, praying silently with eyes that no longer searched for answers. When the names reached the end, a moment of silence was called. Tunde closed his eyes. He saw again the baby in the Yar airport. Her fists clenched, face red, eyes wide. He saw the gate closing, the sound of the engine, the silver body of the plane rising into the gold morning air, carrying with it a version of him that no longer existed. The businessman, the planner, the man who moved too fast to hear anything smaller than his own ambition. And then he opened his eyes and looked around, not at the candles, but at the people. The real story, he realized, wasn't just about the ones who died. It was about the ones who stayed, the ones who carried on. The mother who got up each day and packed her son's school bag without him. The brother who kept calling the number just to hear the voicemail. The child who would grow up only with stories of their parent. And yes, the man who missed the flight because he turned around, because he paused, because he listened to the scream. The memorial ended quietly. No dramatic final notes. Just the slow, scattered sound of folding chairs being lifted, umbrellas being opened, and feet returning to earth. On his way back to his car, Tunde passed a group of children from one of the local schools. Their teacher was speaking softly, pointing to the banners, explaining what had happened. One of the children, a boy no older than 6, tugged on the teacher's sleeve and asked, "Did anyone survive?" The teacher hesitated. Tunde paused. Then, without thinking, he stepped forward, knelt gently in front of the boy and spoke softly. "No one on the flight," he said. "But someone survived because they didn't get on." The boy looked at him, curious. "Why didn't they?" Tunde smiled faintly. "Because something stopped them. Something small. Something that looked like a problem, but wasn't." The boy nodded as if he understood, then turned and walked away. Tunde remained kneeling for a moment, his heart strangely light. Later that evening, he returned to Sade's home. The air was warm, filled with the soft sound of crickets and the distant beating of a drum from a nearby church. She opened the door before he knocked, as if she had sensed him coming. "She's awake," she said, stepping aside. Adais was sitting, upright now on a small mat in the corner, clapping her hands at nothing in particular, lost in the wild joy of being alive. Tunde stepped inside slowly, sat down beside her, and held out his finger. She grabbed it instantly, strong, certain. He looked at Said, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. "You know, I used to think she was a burden," she whispered. "An interruption. I was alone. Her father left before she was born. I didn't think I was strong enough. I was even thinking, that morning at the airport." Her voice trailed off. But then she screamed. And now, every day I look at her, I know that scream was the sound of God shaking both of us awake. Tunde swallowed hard. He understood, because that scream had woken him too. They sat in silence as the child cooed and babbled beside them. Outside, the stars began to shimmer. Not loudly, just enough to remind the world that even in the deepest dark, there is light. Before he left, Sade wrapped Adais in a soft cloth and placed her in his arms. Not as a gesture of gratitude anymore, but of trust. Of something quieter. He held the child close, her breath against his neck, and closed his eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. In his chest, the silence felt full, like a lesson finally understood. Weeks passed, then months. The days lengthened. The heavy rains came and softened the red earth. Children in the village returned to school under a roof that no longer leaked. They sat on real desks now, their fingers tracing letters with confidence instead of guessing, in the dust. Lights stayed on through the night. Mosquito nets covered sleeping forms. Slowly, quietly, life stitched itself back together in ways too small for newspapers to notice. Tunde stayed longer than planned. He rented a modest house near the school, simple and neat, with a garden full of cassava and 3 chickens that never obeyed him. His shoes grew dusty, his beard grew thicker, and his name faded from the list of Lagos's most promising tech entrepreneurs. But in exchange, something else grew. Not fame, not fortune, but depth. A life with roots, not just branches. He began journaling each morning at dawn, sitting on the porch with a cup of weak tea and the hum of insects all around him. He no longer wrote about margins or scale or shareholder returns. Instead, he wrote about breath. About the way Adais smiled now, wide and unafraid, with a gap between her teeth like her mother's. About the boy at school who asked if the moon was made of powdered yam. About the old woman who wept when he fixed the light in her kitchen. Not because of the electricity, but because she hadn't seen her own face in a mirror at night for 20 years. He came to understand that the life he had once chased had not been wrong, only incomplete. There was nothing evil in ambition, but unchecked, it had deafened him to the small interruptions that were never interruptions at all, but whispers from a gentler, wiser world. He visited the crash site once. Quietly, alone. The area had been cordoned off and cleared. A wooden sign stood in the grass with all 73 names etched carefully into it. There was no music, no audience, just birds, wind, a patch of scorched soil that still smelled faintly of fuel and sorrow. Tunde walked the perimeter slowly, as if every blade of grass held a memory. He stopped in front of the sign, removed his shoes, and stood barefoot. A silent gesture of reverence. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply closed his eyes, bowed his head, and whispered one word. In his mind, thank you. Not because he was spared, but because he had been awakened. Because he had been reminded that life is not made only of progress, but of presence. That sometimes, the very thing we curse, the delay, the detour, the scream, is not a mistake, but a gift in disguise. That night, back in his home, he sat with Saad and Adais under the mango tree. The baby was asleep across his lap, her chest rising and falling in gentle waves. Fireflies floated between the branches. Sade was peeling oranges with her hands, humming again, the same soft tune that had become part lullaby, part hymn, part memory. Tunde looked down at the child, then up at the stars. He thought about that morning at the airport. The scream, the pause, the choice. How close he had come to death without knowing it. How life had reached out not with thunder, but with the voice of a child in need. He looked at Sade. "She saved me," he said quietly. "I thought I was helping her, but really, she pulled me out of a life that was already crashing." Sade didn't reply. She just nodded, like she had known this all along. Later, after she had gone inside and the baby stirred softly in her sleep, Tunde remained outside beneath the stars. He opened his journal and wrote a single sentence. Not long, not poetic, just true. Sometimes the flight you miss is the life you're meant to live. And he closed the book, and exhaled, and smiled. Not wide, not triumphant,